Hey guys, Ron here. Hope everyone's well. I was going to do a video tonight where I was going to drive through Venice, California at night. Of course, there's somebody coming the minute I start. But I figured driving and showing you guys the scenery and talking would be, I didn't think that I'd be able to concentrate as well as I could. So, okay. So I'm going to take a walk. And because where I live happens to be around boats and beach, I hope you're not sick of it. I'm going down another area though. I'm going to show you some more harbor views, but not the one I'm usually at. I haven't been here in months. So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about James Johnson Jr., born in 1948 in Buffalo, New York. He was better known to the world as Rick James. And I'll tell you, he wrote a song, he co-wrote a song called Super Freak, probably his most famous song. I remember when I was a teenager in 1981, never really heard anything like that before. And I'll tell you, Rick James, he was a super freak. He didn't write it about himself, he wrote it about a girl, but I think he could, in fact, his biography, his autobiography was titled Confessions of a Super Freak or something along those lines, and I think it was well deserved because Rick James was the epitome of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, obviously there are a lot of other musicians who are like that, and eventually, I mean, the fact that Rick made it to age 56 is unbelievable to me. The way he abused his body with drugs is astonishing, but he was an incredible party animal, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about his life, what he did, what happened to him, and just what the hell happened to him. So without further ado, let's talk about Rick James Johnson Jr. I like this pool. In the summer, there's obviously more people out here. Looks like there's not even anybody in the jacuzzi tonight. Maybe it's closed. In a matter of like a week or two, it was still mild at night. Now it's cold, or it's cold for us Southern Californians. You're gonna laugh when I tell you, but I'm wearing a sweatshirt, and it was, it was hot for months and months on end, day and night. I'm wearing a sweatshirt now because it's 64 degrees and breezy. Feels cooler than 64. But that's what the temperature says. Temperature gauge. I checked out that restaurant months ago. Eat out there on the patio overlooking the harbor. It's nice. So let's talk about James Johnson Jr., Rick James. So Rick James was one of 8 kids, born, like I said, in 1948 in Buffalo. His father left the family when he was 10, so the mother raised all 8 kids basically as a single mother. And she was tough. Among other things, she worked for a numbers racket. She worked for the organized crime members, the mob, running numbers and doing other things for money to support the family. Now, Rick described her as being a tyrant and verbally and physically abusive, but at the same time, he said he loved her and missed her very dearly. That she was, like I say, a strict disciplinarian. And interesting, he quoted her as using the same line that Marvin Gaye's father said to Marvin Gaye: "I brought you into this world, and I can take you out of this world." Exact same line that I remember Marvin Gaye's father saying to him, Marvin Gaye Jr., his son. I think his father was senior, and then he killed his son, Marvin Gaye. So he followed through on his threat about taking him out. But anyway, that's what Rick James said about his mother. He also said, though, that after his mother died, he declined into even further darkness than he had been in the rest of his life due to grief and depression. It seems clear to me, and Rick did eventually, well, let's start from the beginning, somewhat. Rick James, which was another one of his aliases he had to use basically, he was exposed to music through his mother, through these nightclubs, through this dodgy gambling that she was involved in. He was exposed to nightclubs and music early on. Anyway, he was a mischievous child with his siblings and began, according to him, he lost his virginity at age 9 by a wild older girl in the neighborhood, which I believe. I mean, it makes perfect sense if we're talking about Rick James, right? And he was a little wild kid. I mean, which progressed into a criminal-leaning teenager. He was stealing cars. He was stealing things just for fun. There's not a lot of records of him being a violent guy, but he was definitely stealing and started in with drugs very early on. And he said it was just a natural thing, especially for him and the guys of his band. They were just stoned all the time. Wake up, smoke dope. Well, so when Rick was, I believe, 15, he entered military. Oh gosh, I don't want to. I'm about to make an error here because I was going to say Coast Guard, but it wasn't the Coast Guard. What his intention was he lied about his age. He wanted to avoid military service in Vietnam. So he eventually took off, and when it was found out what he had done, there was a point where he was going to be sent immediately to Vietnam, to the Vietnam War, which he fled to Canada. When he was in Canada, he was doing, among other things, he started pimping. In fact, pimping out his own girlfriends. Now, he later said he had regrets over this. He wasn't very good at it. I don't know if he said he wasn't very good at it. I doubt that. But he said that he was a kind pimp, he said. You know, he never made them work if they were too tired. Didn't beat them. I don't know if he said they didn't beat them. I shouldn't assume that. But he was a benevolent pimp. Maybe he even let them keep, a fraction of their own money, too. But who knows? So anyway, besides the pimping that he was doing in Canada, he met Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, formed a group called the Mynah Birds, and eventually Neil Young was part of the Mynah Birds. Bruce Palmer, who would eventually be in the Buffalo Springfield with Neil Young. He was all over the place, Rick James, and then eventually, through some business dealings with the label and other problems, he was found out where he was, and he actually turned himself in, and he did serve some months of hard labor in a military prison. So after all that, he started, his music career in earnest, and really started by writing songs for other people. And if you listen to interviews with Rick James, I'm thinking of one in particular with Tom Snyder. Oh, Tom Snyder, yeah. In 1998, to which, of course, James claims to be clean and sober, but as we know now from his autopsy, he was not completely clean. He still had cocaine in his system. It probably was a demon that he never outran. But anyway, Rick James, I was very impressed by his intelligence, by how well spoken he was, thoughtfulness, great with memories, remembering things. This was a bright guy and a very talented guy, but a very, very troubled guy. And how many times have we seen that with artists? With artists, I mean visual artists, painters, musicians, actors, actresses, directors, writers. It just comes with the territory sometimes. So, Rick James was, another tortured soul, apparently, according to him and according to people around him. And he actually got a record deal Oh, he was heard early on. He was heard by Stevie Wonder, and people were impressed with his talent. He went from drumming to playing bass. He played some guitar, and he eventually started putting out his own records. 1978, 79, 80, gold records, doing pretty well. Had Prince opening for him in 1980, and he was very upset with Prince because he said that Prince was stealing his style, his style on stage, and various aspects of, which is ironic because just years later he started opening for Prince, and I think he said he stole a PA system from Prince and then later returned it, or maybe a keyboard, some piece of equipment. Anyway, so here he was, Prince was opening for him, things were going well, and in 1981 he releases a concept album, which I believe was his fifth album, Street Songs, and that was a huge hit. Give It To Me Baby and Super Freak. And Super Freak was a huge hit, and what was interesting also, kind of like, I don't want to make a direct comparison to Thriller, but kind of like the music on Thriller, Rick James' music at that point, even on that particular album in 81, there were elements of rock, pop, funk. I'd say probably mostly those three. And you know what? It just worked. It worked in the rock community, the pop community, the funk community, the R&B community. Let's say R&B also. Very eclectic, and it worked, just like with Thriller. So, obviously, nothing sold as much as Thriller, but we've already talked about MJ, or I have here. So, he has this great success, Rick James, and he's really flouting his beliefs as the years go by. And that was his peak. That was his peak, 1981. And as the years go by into the 80s, he's talking about using drugs. He's talking about sex. And you younger guys wouldn't believe the difference between now and then. In other words, now we're in a society where basically, as far as I'm concerned, anything goes. There are zero taboos, and there are, leaked sex tapes and so on and so forth. Well, in those days, when MTV was brand new, they were very reluctant to play Rick James because they said he was just literally too vulgar. I can imagine MTV now saying anything's too vulgar. If anything, they won't play anything probably isn't vulgar enough. Anyway, so, but they consider it vulgarity. Rick James said it was racism, and said that there wasn't enough. And this is also something for you younger folks too. You'll never believe, but he said there was underrepresentation by black artists in 1981, 1982, because unlike today, where rap and hip hop is the dominant music, then it was rock and pop. And of course, there are a lot of black artists, including Michael Jackson, of course. But maybe there was some truth to it. Maybe it was 75% white artists, rockers, and rock and rollers and pop stars versus 25. I don't know what the percentage. I seem to remember, because I watched MTV in its early days, I seem to remember videos by all kinds of groups and artists. But anyway, that was his claim. And through the years, Rick was a controversial figure, and his sales started dropping, and he actually was involved for about 5 years with the actress Linda Blair, who in some interview in some magazine said she found him sexy. He found a way to get a hold of her, and they started having a relationship. I remember that, actually. In fact, I remember at the time people saying how controversial it was because, Rick was this, not that Linda Blair was known as any paragon of sainthood, but Rick was really a controversial party animal kind of guy. And I remember there was controversy even at the time. He later said that she had an abortion with his child, which really bothered him. He did have other children, but he said that, I guess, according to him, family and children, I don't want to say believe it or not, family and children were a big thing to him, very important to him. And that he said the breakup was bad, she kind of froze him out of her life, and so on and so forth. But several years later, there was another girlfriend, and I remember this at the time, I believe this is up in the Hollywood Hills. He and his girlfriend were accused of basically kidnapping and torturing a woman on a 3-day cocaine binge. And then while Rick was out on jail, and I believe his, as he said his lay, I believe his girlfriend, who would later become his wife, was out on bail too. They apparently kidnapped and tortured another woman during another cocaine binge. And I don't mean extreme physical torture, but sexual stuff going on. I'm sure you can imagine what insanity must have gone on with doing freebase and crack for 72 straight hours or so. Well, the first case, I believe he was acquitted, but the second case he was convicted. And he did serve time behind bars because of that. Now, Rick has said that in jail, he said other prisoners came to him and said, you should be out there being a role model for young black people. He says, these prisoners, these guys in prison with him would come to him. He said it was almost on like a daily basis, come and sort of preach to him. They said, you had everything, money, fame, power, your music, and why are you in here with us? And a lot of those guys had claimed that they had done stupid things, but stupid things included murder and and beatings and assault and stuff, mostly under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Which brings me to the subject. Can you imagine, folks, this is just Ron here preaching, could you imagine if drugs and alcohol didn't exist? 99% of crime would evaporate overnight, because not only do a lot of people commit crimes to get money for their drug habit, I guess secondarily, I guess you can get cheap booze, but let's say for your drug habit, but look at all the crime that's committed while people are under the influence, including domestic abuse. I mean, geez, every time the cops have to roll out to a domestic abuse, domestic battery case, I would imagine 90% of the time it involves alcohol. Anyway, that's just my little preaching that how destructive drugs are to our nation, in my opinion. Like I've said before, and I'll say it here, we don't have to worry about our enemies bombing us, foreign enemies bombing America. We're just killing ourselves with drugs, mainly. Alcohol too. I mean, go to any AA or NA meeting in any city in America and it'll be packed every time, I would imagine. Okay, and in my little speech, and the irony is that it's all, and in Rick's case too, admittedly he said it was self-medicating. He was using so he wouldn't feel the pain emotionally he was suffering. If more people would do yoga, meditate, exercise, have therapy, eat well, be with friends and family, be a better country, wouldn't it? Flush all that dope down the toilet. I hate when I get on these anti-drugs rant. I just, we see so many of our young people, especially, and older people, of all kinds of people, including Rick James, eventually. I mean, the reason Rick James died at 56 was because of drugs. Now, he didn't OD, although according to him, he had OD'd many times. So, in fact, not only that, he said that there were times when he took drugs, many times he said he took drugs with the hope that he wouldn't wake up, that he would OD to the point of death. And to me, that's a very, very sad statement. But you hear it from other addicts, especially when they can't control their addiction. And it's interesting too, because Rick James said something similar to David Crosby, although, and I've done a vlog on David Crosby too. David Crosby doesn't directly say it, but James said that when he was snorting cocaine, it was one thing. He said when he started freebasing, he said it was a whole different ballgame, and that's when the addiction really took hold. And with David Crosby, his nose was so jacked up that he had to stop snorting coke. He started doing liquid cocaine. Drops on that didn't really help, so he started freebasing. And when Crosby started freebasing, just like Rick James, that's when the addiction took over. And heroin, cocaine, sends these people, not only do they have grand mal seizures and OD, but into psychosis sometimes. So by the mid 90s, so Rick James gets out of jail, and he says that he was sort of effectively scared straight, and that he wasn't going to use anymore, and his mission now was to preach to young people. And he always wanted to get his career back on track, of course, and was working on getting his career back on track. In fact, in the late 90s, he was talking about his autobiography that he wanted to come out, and obviously financial gain too. I skipped something earlier about before the assault convictions and the torture kidnapping. MC Hammer sampled something that Rick didn't know about at the time. MC Hammer sampled, for his song Can't Touch This, Super Freak, without the permission of Rick James. So of course there was a lawsuit, and eventually MC Hammer had to pay, or the record company, I guess, royalties, I believe in perpetuity, probably to this day, to the estate of Rick James for the use of the sampling that he did for Can't Touch This. So Rick James ended up making a lot of money, admittedly, off Can't Touch This. And eventually he patched things up with his sort of feud with MC Hammer. In fact, they even performed together, and he actually performed that song. So it seems to me that Rick was really always wanting to get his career back on track. And why wouldn't he? I mean, he was a musician. He needed the money. That's what he did. That was his life. I'm sure he missed the roar of the crowd. But he had other issues as well. I mean, he had a lot of issues, and a lot of them were associated with not taking care of yourself. Diabetes. He actually had a hip replacement too in the 90s, which was basically just from jumping on stage and kicking. If you watch him, he would do a lot of kicks, especially through the 80s on stage, and this kicking actually just messed with his hips to the point where he needed a hip replacement. Now, what I'm wondering is, when he was in pain before the hip replacement and after the surgery, was he given opiates to deal with it? I mean, they are loath to want to give opiates and drugs to a quote-unquote recovering drug addict. Same with David Crosby when he had his liver transplant, also in the 90s. So anyway, Rick James had the hip replacement and the diabetes, and eventually in the late 90s had a stroke and was inserted with a pacemaker. So all kinds of problems, and finally, health-wise, I mean. And finally, in 2004, after being out of the limelight for many years, he was found, I don't know if he was alone at the time or whether he had a significant other with him, children, anybody, but my research showed that he was found by what they call his caretaker. Maybe it was literally a medical caretaker. Maybe it was a caregiver, actually. Probably was. And Rick was dead at age 56. There were 9 different drugs in his system. He did not die of an overdose, although he had small amounts of cocaine in his system. So like I said at the outset here, unfortunately Rick was still using at the time of his death, which doesn't surprise me, all that much. But he had antidepressants, anti-anxieties in his system, which is also common a lot, including with Elvis, when we find these multiple drugs in their system. Well, Elvis didn't have the anti-anxieties, but he had uppers, downers, all kinds of things. But with Rick James, did have the anti-anxieties, and it's just too bad. It's too bad that the demons sometimes just can't be overcome. And there were thousands of people that attended a memorial service here in Los Angeles at Forest Lawn, which is actually the huge cemetery next to the cemetery where my whole family basically is buried. My mom and my dad and aunt and uncle and grandmother and so forth. Did I say uncles? Yeah, a couple of uncles too. So anyway, that was the sad ending of Rick James, but Rick James is a very talented individual. Like I said, seemed to be intelligent and well-spoken. Ooh, boy, somebody's coming towards me smoking dope. and it's kind of fitting for this video. There we go. So let's just pass by here for a minute. Oh no, I am wrong. I have to apologize. When I get closer, it smells more like a cigar. Could be a blunt. See, I know. I'm hip, right? I'm not sure what it was. Does it matter? Not really. Okay, guys. Well, from Southern California, a chilly night, 63 degrees on breeze. That's chilly. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it, guys. I'm going to try to get out to do some daytime shots, videos soon at some houses and locations. I know that's the most popular. It's just hard for me to get to, and I've done so many people, I'm kind of running out of people, but I'm always on the prowl for more. Anyway, subjects, that is, more subjects. Ron here. If you like the channel, please do subscribe if you haven't already. If you do, push the notification button, and please give me likes. And if you've commented before, you know that most likely, unless your comment is kind of nonsensical, which very few are, I will comment back. I love the dialogue between us, guys. Okay, I will see you at the next location. Thank you. Bye-bye.